was born in Koyukuk, Alaska. He's Koyukon Athabascan and Italian. He was raised in a traditional subsistence lifestyle, going to school when he was 7. He went to Management High School and he earned 2 degrees, an aeronautical and electrical engineering degree from Northrop University. He's a U.S. Navy veteran, and he worked for the Minuteman Ballistic Missile Unit. He's received 2 honorary doctorates from the University of Alaska, Anchorage. In 1963, he had the honorary doctorate of Humane Letters, as well as the University of Alaska, Anchorage, received in 2013. At 34 years old, he was the first president of the Alaska Federation of Natives, and he negotiated the terms of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. He's been a previous commissioner for the Department of Commerce, Community, and Economic Development, and later Commerce, Community, and Economic Development. He's held a lot of positions throughout the state, and he enjoys spending his time with family, including his 6 children and 8 grandchildren. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Emil Notti.
Well, since we don't have a very big crowd, feel free to stop me if you want for questions. We could almost make it a conversation. I'm going to assume that most of you know quite a bit about land claims, so I won't talk about the elements of the claims. I'll try to describe the conditions in Alaska and some of the people we dealt with, and give you a feel for the atmosphere that we were working in. The Alaskan Native claims occurred during a period of turmoil in America. There was protests against the Vietnam War. Students were shot on campus. President Johnson's war on poverty, rioting in the streets, civil rights marches. And I'll tell you about one. We got into D.C. We're going to testify tomorrow morning. And about 10 o'clock, I was already in my room, and somebody said, my phone rang and said, turn on the TV. And so I turned it on. There was riots down on 14th Street in Washington, D.C. So we decided that would be something we ought to go see. So we went down, walked down there, and cars were burning and trash all over the street. Storefronts were broken in, and we walked through this craziness. The next day we talking to our lawyers, and they said, you guys stay away from that. You're going to get shot if you go down there. So, but it was kind of different to see. In Alaska, there were protests all over the state from the different regions. And the protests were, because of lands that were being transferred from the federal government to the state of Alaska. Their state had a right to select 103 million acres of land. They were protesting it. We stopped the federal government from transferring land to homesteaders and to cabin sites. And we stopped all of that, all the transfers of land. But the protests were, before we got them stopped, were being ignored by BLM. And there was uneasiness because of that. And just some of the things that were going on in Alaska was Kotzebue. In Kotzebue, there was land being held in trust for Native people, and the lots were being sold. And no one was benefiting from it. The trustees were getting the money. So in Tenacross, the state was sold 1 square inch of land at the New York World's Fair. And people were coming into Tenacross, and it's on the highway, and saying, where's my square inch of land? So it was crazy. a lot of things were happening in the state that people knew nothing about. There was a plan by the Atomic Energy Commission to blow a hole in the shoreline to create a deep water port. And they had to file a petition for use of the land. And in the petition, they said there are no people in the area, only a few Eskimos. So things like that were upsetting people. There was a plan to dam the Yukon River that would have put underwater a dozen villages. And there was total disregard for what had happened to the villagers. One of the big protests was in Minto Village, about 90 miles from Fairbanks. In the Yukon the Minto Flats area was a breadbasket for the people who lived there. There were ducks and fish and moose and for trapping and other things. And the state was getting land there and selling it for hunting sites, remote hunting sites. That was being protested. Now, the states also sold land, state leased land on a couple, there's thousands of acres, and they got $900 million for the leases. There are some people who think Native people got too much money during the settlement. We got $962.5 million for all of Alaska. And here the state got $900 million for a lease on just a few thousand acres of land. So it wasn't all that generous considering. And down here in Tlingit country, 18 million acres of land was turned into the Tongass National Forest. They got $7.2 million for that. So there was also talk about building the pipeline. That would cross many native land areas. And what happens was we were getting conflict for the use of land because we had complete freedom on the land. And we weren't used to people crossing trapping areas and hunting areas and coming down the river and stopping at fish camps. And so people were anxious for what's happening. People were anxious because their lifestyle was changing fast. And they wanted the land transfers to stop. And during all this, the governor and his attorney general knew nothing about land. They claimed that Native people had no rights to land. The history that they learned in school was that Russia bought Alaska. But, we argued that Russia had nothing to sell. They didn't own Alaska. They didn't buy it. It wasn't given to them. And they didn't win it in war. And all they ever had in Alaska was a trading company, fur trading company. So we claim that they sold the stockades that they lived behind because they didn't have control of the country. In Sitka, when the Russian flag came down and the American flag went up, here's what the historian Herbert Howie Bancroft said. Thus, without further ceremony, this vast area of land belonging to neither was transferred from one European race to the offshoot of another. And Congress knew they didn't have good title to Alaska. The Department of Interior was aware of it. They had dealt with the land problem and had different plans and talked about it almost from the time that the transfer was made by the Russians. So they knew natives had Aboriginal title, and that's a good title. It's recognized. The peak population in Russia for when the Russians were here was, one estimate is about 804. I see other estimates of 830 or 40. But at the same time, there were only about 200 Americans in the territory, and there was some fear that the Native people would drive the Americans out. And the effort of the United States government has always been to populate the country. The Homestead Act was a population driver. People flocked to Alaska to get 160 acres of land without paying cash for it. They had to clear 40 acres of it and live on it for 2 years. And there's a lot of people became millionaires in Anchorage just from that. There was a newspaper story one time that there were 50 millionaires in Anchorage from the 160-acre lots that they got on the hillside, which was way out of town at the time. And then the farmers that were relocated to Palmer was a population driver. World War II was a big population driver. A lot of people came up here for construction to build the airports and Navy bases and Army camps. And after the war, many of those workers stayed because, like say, Alaska used to be a nice place to live. The first 17 years of Alaska, under the American flag, Alaska was ruled by the military. The question is often asked, what legal ground was there for native land claims? Governor Hickel said natives had no legal claim to the land, but there might be a moral reason to have a settlement. I remember a memorable broadcast that went statewide when Governor Hickel said, just because someone's grandparent chased a moose across the tundra does not give them any title to land. But the courts knew different. The courts ordered payment to the Tlingit and Haida people for land ownership when they lost the Tongass National Forest. So the legal issue about land entitlement and ownership was already settled. It was just a matter of when to get around to it. And we based our settlement arguments on 3 major documents. First was a Treaty of Cessions that said the Alaskan Natives will be subject to such laws and regulations as other tribes in America. And to me that implied Congress had to deal with the issue of title. The second reason was the Organic Act of 1884. That was enacted 17 years after the Russian flag came down. And that said natives would not be disturbed in a possession or use or occupancy of land or land claimed by them. And the Organic Act was the first civil law for Alaska after military rule. But it gave specific protection to miners' claims and the use of land by missionaries. The preamble was very nice about protecting native rights to land, but in fact, it was, I think, mainly to give miners a place to file claims because the military did not accept mining claims. That's not one of the things that they do. And again, the terms for the natives to acquire title to land was reserved for future legislation by Congress. And the third act was the Statehood Act. The Statehood Act had a clause that said the state and its inhabitants forever disclaim any right or title to lands held by Eskimos, Indians, or Aleuts. And again, the right or title was left to future Congress or the courts. But with all the protests against state selections and a transfer of 103 acres of land, 103 million acres of land to Alaska, Congress took an interest, more so after the courts refused to lift the land freeze. In January 1966, here's what triggered us into organizing for a settlement. In January 1966, Bob Bennett was an Oneida Indian right here in Juneau. He was head of the BIA, and he got selected to be the commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And while he was being vetted for fitness by Congress, excuse me for a minute, the chairman of the Senate Interior Committee, Senator Henry Jackson of Washington State, directed Mr. Bennett to summarize the Indian problem in Alaska. Excuse me, Indian problem across America, because the senator said to Bob Bennett, you're an Indian yourself. What would you do different? The United States spends hundreds of millions of dollars a year on the Indian problem in America, and nothing changes. For the past 200 years, Indians are always on the bottom, every way you looked at the data. High infant mortality, 34-year lifespan, poor housing, underachievement in education, high unemployment. What would you do different? Bob Bennett started to answer, and Scoop Jackson stopped him and told him to come back in 90 days with a written report about what his plans were. That report came out in April in 1966. I don't remember how I got a copy of it, but I read the section on Alaska, and I knew nothing about it. I was working as a young engineer, knew nothing about Indian law or Congress or legislation, like most of us did. Everybody in Alaska, basically, even our Attorney General and Governor, had no experience with it, so none of us knew what we were doing. I read the report in April when it came out and set it aside. I didn't know what to do with it. I thought if we had rights, we should have something to say about what that settlement is. So after thinking about it, in July, I wrote a letter and sent it to 14 people around the state, that some I knew by reputation. And I asked for a meeting to be held in Anchorage in October 1966. By then I had the advice of attorney Stanley McCutcheon. He was compliments of the Tyonek Indian village outside of Anchorage there. So I sent a copy of my letter to Howard Rock. He was an editor of the Tundra Times. He encouraged and promoted the meeting. It was a weekly newspaper, and he had a story almost weekly in promoting the statewide meeting called for in October. So instead of 14 people showing up, 300 people showed up. There were these anxious people out in the rural areas that were seeing so many strangers crossing the land and land being deeded to the state, and they were very unsettled, unhappy about what was going on. There were two men, Nick Gray and Howard Rock, Eskimos. They were from Nome, one from Nome, one from Point Hope. Both of them had in the past advocated for statewide meeting, as well as A and B had from time to time tried to expand across the state. They got to Copper Center, Nenana, Tanana, but it takes money to organize, and it didn't really happen. But Nick Gray organized the Fairbanks Native Association. When he got that going, he came to Anchorage, organized the Cook Inlet Native Association. Then he got leukemia. And when we called the meeting to order, Nick got off of his sick bed and came and talked to the meeting. And he was happy at finally, here was a statewide meeting, something that he'd been trying for years. So I think he was happy that his efforts were paying off. But we scheduled a meeting for October 1966, specifically to get the attention of candidates for statewide office. So the candidates really took advantage of it. It cost, excuse me, in a campaign to go across Alaska and talk to people, to take $20,000, $30,000 in a week or two to go through the villages. So the statewide politicians were happy. There were a governor and a congressman and a senator were running. They came to our meetings. They were happy to be able to talk to the leaders from across the villages and across the state. So the meeting was 3 days. Someone hosted a lunch and a dinner every day for that time. Charlie Edwardson said nobody bought a meal for 3 days during the meetings. But it was the cheapest thing for the politicians to do, and we questioned each of them where they stood on a land claim settlement. And they were very hard pressed to come to a decision. But most of them promised to do something, but most of them weren't very firm about it either. But the various groups were anxious to get together to make their claims known. Stanley McCutcheon invited a Washington, D.C. attorney familiar with Indian law, and that was necessary, even though what we were doing went beyond Indian law. It went directly to Congress, and we didn't depend on the courts. So there was a pastor, Felton Griffin, from First Baptist Church of Anchorage. He was invited to make the keynote or welcome speech. And I was really surprised. He made a very inspiring speech. And it provided the encouragement that we needed. And we appreciated it. It made us feel like we had the high ground. And so we were happy to listen to them. At the meeting, we sent out a land committee. The Marvin Sanowski, the attorney from Washington, D.C., assisted the committee, but Willie Hensley, we appointed Willie Hensley as chairman of that committee. Well, there were two people that knew more about land claims than anybody else in the room, and that was John Borbridge and Willie Hensley. And so they came up with a position paper on native lands in Alaska. That position paper got introduced, was the first bill introduced in Congress, and it became Senate Bill 2020. It was adopted by the delegates and later introduced. It was introduced in April of 1967. Our meeting had been October of 66, so. But when we called the meeting to order, it was about 7 o'clock in the morning, 10 o'clock in the morning. And the Anchorage newspaper, the afternoon paper, was just going to press about 10 in the morning. The newspaper hit the streets about 2 in the afternoon. And the biggest story in the paper was that the Native people were split. We had the statewide meeting, and and we were in turmoil. It was disagreements. Well, that was just an attempt to drive us apart because we just came to order when they went to press, so that was just a fantasy story. We'd never met statewide before. We didn't know each other. There were people still alive who remembered some of the raids between the villages from up north. So it took us a while to, even though those my age, weren't experienced with it, our parents were. My mother remembered a raid. So history wasn't that old when we met the first time. So in January, we agreed to form a group. In Fairbanks, we met in January '67. And the Attorney General was sent up there by the governor to inform us that we had no rights and wondered what we were doing. And our attorney, Stanley McCutcheon, was born in Alaska, and the old-time Anchorage person. And he was a fantastic speaker. So in our meeting, these two lawyers went at it, was saying got no rights, and the other one was defending the rights, and it was exciting to watch for an hour as they debated. The Attorney General went out and got drunk after the meeting. He got beat up so bad and verbally. In April '67, our position paper became Senate Bill 2020, the first of 8 bills. Everybody did get into the act and wrote their own bills. Senate Interior Committee, State of Alaska, House Interior Committee, Federal Field Committee, which as a presidential appointee was the chairman. There were 8 bills in all, and it was important for us to get a bill written. If we waited for the BIA to Department of Interior had a bill also. If they got the first bill in, we would be testifying to modify their bill. And the fact that we got a bill in first, people were trying to modify our bill. It made had a whole different feel to it, I think, if we didn't do that. But we had a hard time developing a bill, too. Can you imagine trying to write a bill by committee? 50 people in the room. So it wasn't a lot of fun, but there's a lot of good arguments. The state opposed us because of our protests that were being filed. This BLM stopped the transfers of land. And it was the trigger that stopped the land was Stanley McCutcheon got on the phone and called the Secretary of Interior and convinced him the Secretary of Interior was a protector of native lands, and he had to protect this native lands from being transferred. And he did. He put the freeze on, and that stopped everything. And we needed that. My feeling was, if we didn't hold the freeze, this land problem would have been an Indian problem. And if it's an Indian problem, who cares? When it became a problem for the state, it became a problem for miners, and became a problem for homesteaders and people camping, remote sites, and trade and manufacturing sites, airfields, everything was stopped. When it became everybody's problem, the pressure built to settle this thing. And when the oil companies started having their toes pinched a little bit, we were always a little bit paranoid what the oil companies would do. So we were always kind of watching, but they were very careful. I think when they got ready, we had the pipeline right away stopped. It's a 30-year lease by the oil companies on this right away. And when that stopped, I don't know this, but my feeling that the oil company said, solve this problem. We don't care what the terms of the agreement is. We don't care what you have to do to settle it, just settle it. And when they did that, things happened. The state accused us. There's a lot of emotion going on. The state accused us of driving the state into bankruptcy because the state didn't have a tax base. They were taking land and selling it. There used to be signs along the highway from Anchorage to Fairbanks and Talkeetna, a little sign on the trees that would, if you took the number off of that sign, you could go into the Department of Natural Resources and put $500 down, $50 a month. For $5,000, you'd have yourself land, and that was stopped. The state was turning land into money to run government, and that's why they said we're driving the state into bankruptcy. The editorials around the state opposed us. All the papers, I used to read these editorials from all over the state that opposed us. The State Chamber of Commerce mocked us. We had an annual meeting here in Juneau. The director put on a big hat and had an arrow through it and made fun of our effort. And mayors opposed us, industry-backed organizations. There are about 12 organizations in the state that are paid for by industries, and they promote growth all the time. And they were opposed to us because all wealth comes from the land, and the land was not being worked. So they were definitely against us. And Hickel filed a lawsuit against the Interior Department to lift the land freeze. But when Hickel became Secretary of Interior, he found himself defending against the suit that he filed. And the state finally lost the lawsuit, and it went into the law books as Hickel v. Hickel. So just one of the things that I was getting, we were into a lot of things besides pushing for land. We got into anywhere there was a problem. I got a call one day to go to Bethel. So I got on a plane and went to Bethel, and there was a state trooper on the plane, full dress uniform, and I knew the guy. He was a nice guy. He's old-time family from Wasilla. So on the plane to Bethel, we were talking, and he wanted to know why I was going to Bethel. And I said, well, I wasn't sure. There was something going on in Bethel. So I asked him why he was going to Bethel. He didn't know either. He got a call from the governor's office that said, go to Bethel. And he didn't know what was going on. When we got off the plane, we found Chuck Cicero, who was a representative from Big Lake, was on the radio in Bethel, and he was talking to the people there. And he was telling the fishermen, sell your fish to the Japanese. You won't go to jail. There was fear. The people out there were afraid that they're going to go to jail. Somehow the word got out that if they sold to the Japanese, they would get arrested. So there was a deputy commissioner out there and other state officials. It was pretty intimidating because people didn't understand what was going on for a lot. So I got into a small float plane and we went down the river, and we'd beach the plane. I'd climb the bank and stop in a fish camp. And a typical fish camp had two tents. One was for sleeping, one was for cooking. You had 3 generations. You had little kids, you had the parents, then you had grandparents. And so I'd climb the bank and tell them it was okay to sell to the Japanese. It was legal. They would not get arrested. And just to show you why they were intimidated, the parents had to interpret what I was saying to the grandparents. There was real fear that they would be arrested. So I got back to Bethel and got on a plane to Juneau. But the issue was the local fish buyers, or Seattle fish buyers mainly, were buying fish in the round. So I went down the beach and watched how they're buying fish. They'd beach their aluminum boats and they'd throw these salmon off, and the buyer was grading them on the fly. He was saying small, medium, and buying the fish in a round. And so I got on the plane, went back to Anchorage, and 10 o'clock that same night, I was coming to Juneau because we were coming down to ask Governor Hickel to support 40 million acres of land to settle. Congress was not going to move against the state, so we needed the state support. So on the way down, we had a 7 o'clock meeting the next day. On the way down, I said to the attorney that was with me, I think after we talk about 40 million acres, I think I'll bring up the issue of what's going on in Bethel, people buying fish illegally, because state law said buy by the pound. And the attorney said, I wouldn't do that. And I didn't know why until the next morning. We were in the governor's office waiting. There were about 4 or 5 of us, and the governor came in, and he was in a fit. He was pounding the table and using some pretty strong language. And he pointed at me and said, "What in the heck, bleep, what were you doing in Bethel taking the governor's office on?" So when the governor talks to you like that, man, I sat up straight and say, maybe we'll talk about that. I didn't have to bring it up. He brought it up. And we talked about that, as well as he had bought, another issue was he bought a tour boat from Norway, and he renamed it the Wickersham. And it's a foreign boat. You can't run foreign boats between American ports. So he had to run that tour from ferry from Vancouver, British Columbia, to coming to Alaska. And he was saying, you guys, you have to help me out. You're always asking me for help. Now you help me. Pick up the phone and call Senator Bartlett and have him repeal the Jones Act. Well, that was an impossible request. The Jones Act is still in effect today. We couldn't be solved just that quick. But after we did have a heated argument with him. I liked Hickel because we had a lot of trouble with him in the beginning when he was governor, because he opposed us. And but after a while, I liked dealing with him, because if you walked in and you had a problem with him, he would either do one or two things. He'd say, "Okay, let's do it," or he would say, "Get out of my office. He's not about to do anything." So that made it easy. If you either solved the problem or you knew what you had to do. So so we talked about support for 40 million acres of land. And finally he agreed to it. He said, I'll support you guys on 40 million acres. Well, we went to Washington, D.C. to testify. And well, before that, after we talked to him about this, calling Bartlett to solve the problem, Bartlett died, and Hickel appointed Ted Stevens to the Senate seat. So anyway, then we got to D.C. to testify, and we're going to testify tomorrow morning. The commissioner for Department of Natural Resources is a guy named Tom Kelly. And he told us that the governor was not going to support 40 million acres of land. And we were pretty upset about that time. So we went down to his hotel and we argued with the commissioner and a couple of his attorneys until about 10 o'clock at night. And then word came from the governor to come on down to his suite. So we walked in and he said, "What's the trouble, boys?" And I said, "Well, Governor, you promised to support 40 million acres of land. And your commissioner tells us you're not going to do it." He said, "If I said that, I will support you." So we get the testimony next day, and the governor gets up on the witness stand or testifying to the Senate and says, "I'll support 40 million acres of settlement, but 20 million has to come from federal withdrawals," which was half support. We knew what we had to do. Later on, we found out that he was being considered for the Department of Interior. He was going to be the head Department of Interior. And he went down to talk to Nixon about it. And on his way back, he switched planes in Seattle to come into Anchorage, and the reporters were there and said, "Governor, what are you going to do about the land freeze?" Well, he had already filed a lawsuit, so he knew what he was doing. So, but his answer was, "What Udall can do with the stroke of a pen, I can undo." He intended to lift the freeze. So there again, we knew what we had to do. So we get back after that, and after his little talk to the newspaper people at Seattle Airport, I got a call at 5 o'clock one night from the attorney, and he said, "Governor wants," no, he didn't say governor, he said, "the Secretary of Interior wants to talk to you." So I said, it took me a minute, but I said, "I don't know where he lives." I figured out it was Hickel, so he said, "They'll pick me up." And we drove over to Hickel's house, and when we walked in, there was a publisher of the Anchorage, the morning paper, Larry Fanning, and with him was his star reporter named Joe Rothstein, and Hickel had in his hand editorial or a piece by Walter Winchell. And Walter Winchell was a nationwide column writer, and his column said, "Hickel does not deserve to be Secretary of Interior because of his treatment of the Eskimos during the fish fight out in Bethel. He didn't treat them right." And so he said, he asked me, "You have contact with outside Indians on the outside?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Can you get me their endorsement?" I said, "Probably." Then he said, "Can you get me the endorsement of Alaska Federation of Natives?" And I said, "Yes, probably. But before I do that, you have to make a public statement that you will not lift the land freeze." We needed that freeze, and I said, if I endorse him and in a month later he lifts the land freeze, if I went and said, "You promised to do so," who cares? He's a governor, Secretary of Interior, and I'm saying, "You promised," and it didn't mean anything. So we left, when we left the place, the attorney was upset. He was really mad. He said, you insulted the governor." And I said, "Well, I didn't think I did." He said, "Yeah, you called him a liar." And so went on, he said, "You're making a mistake. If you don't support him and he doesn't make it, you're going to have to deal with him as governor. If you don't support him and he does make it, you're going to have to deal with him as Secretary of Interior." So that was lose-lose, but I stuck with it. I said I won't endorse him until he do that. So he was so mad, he said, I can't work with you anymore. I quit. So between Hickel's house and when he dropped me back at work, he didn't work for us anymore. So, but that isn't the only time I didn't follow his advice. We started at 80 million acres, and it didn't take us long. We decided we'd go to 40, be reasonable enough. So then I got advice. This lawyer said to me, you got to get real. You're not going to get 40 million acres of land. You got to go for 20. I said, no way. Yeah, we already got to 40. If we go to 20, we'll be bargaining for 10. So we stayed at 40 million acres. Yeah, if I took back a recommendation to the board of directors, they would have had a new AFN president. There's no doubt about that. So later, when the governor was being confirmed for to be Secretary of Interior, the AFN board told me to pick 3 people, 3 board members, and go to D.C. and lobby the Senate to hold the land freeze. So I picked John Borbridge, Eben Hobson. John was from Juneau, Eben Hobson was from Barrow, and Willie Hensley was from Kotzebue. So we went to D.C. and we went down about 2 or 3 days early, and we'd go into the senators on a committee to try to convince them, don't confirm him as Secretary of Interior unless he holds a land freeze. So we'd walk in the door and say, from Alaska, come on in. So they'd take us in a back room and they start asking us all, what do you know about the gas line to Anchorage? What do you know about the road? What do you know about all this hotels and all this Hickel's business? We said, we don't know anything about Hickel's business. All we want to do is hold the land freeze. So we didn't get into that, but they knew from the questions, they knew a lot about what was going on in Alaska. The confirmation hearing lasted 3 days. Every day there were a few senators questioned the governor and tried to get him to promise to hold the land freeze. And he never quite promised to hold the land freeze. On the 3rd day, the chairman walked in, and before he sat down, he banged the meeting to order and looked at the governor and said, Governor, we've been dealing with an issue for the past 2 days, and I thought we put it to rest. But after reading the record last night, I'm not too sure. Will you come back to this committee before you dispose of any federal lands? Then there was silence in the room, and I thought, this is an up or down question. His nomination is hanging in the balance, and he said, yes, I will. He gave up the power of the Secretary of Interior for his confirmation. But during the confirmation, we'd always get to the rooms early and get in the front row. It was a very important nomination because there was a lot of interest. The hearing room was packed every day, so we got there early and get in a row. On the 3rd day, we got there, doors open, we go in. First 3 rows were roped off, so we were in the 4th row. So before the senator came in, here came a whole 3 rows of Alaskan people, and they had chartered an airplane to go down to support the governor. And then Senator Stevens, introduced these outstanding Alaskans who came to support their governor, the very first Alaskan to get a cabinet post. So we're sitting there, and these guys stand up and they turn around and look at us and say, what the heck's wrong with you guys? They didn't use heck, but why aren't you standing up? But we were holding for Hickel's word that he wouldn't lift the freeze. So he did promise. When the time came, I went forward and introduced or supported the governor. Native people in Alaska like him. He'll make a good Department of Interior boss. So Congress was dealing with a number of urgent problems. The biggest one, of course, was Vietnam War, and a lot of demonstrations and what's going on. But one night after dinner, it was dark out. I went for a walk along the mall, and here was this line of lights from far as you could see here, going all the way like this. And there were young people that were holding a paper cup. There was a candle inside of it, and they were protesting the war. They started at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, came across the Memorial Bridge, past the White House, and walked up on the steps of the Capitol. And they had a name tag, and they took it off, called out the name, and dropped it in a casket, and then blew out the candle. And it was very, very moving to see this silent movement of lights going along in a silent protest. But it made a big statement, especially with all the rioting and fighting that was going on. You know, AFN was broke during all this time. People were paying their own ways to go to the meetings, take time off from work, pay their own hotel, airfare, and meals. But we talked to as many places as we could. We had the four horsemen. John Borbridge, Willie, and Evan Hobson, and I were did the heavy lifting. And so we talked wherever we could. John Borbridge got the endorsement from the international AFL-CIO union, which is a big endorsement. Willie Hensley was on Good Morning America. Laura Burke was on a Johnny Carson show. I went to Detroit to talk to the National Council of Churches. And when I got there, the night before I was to talk, I had dinner with this guy. I didn't know who he was, but we talked and asked me what I was doing there, and I told him. And so the next day I get to the meeting. I walk into Copa Hall in Detroit. There's 10,000 preachers. And so before I got started, there's as long as this, there were bishops on this head table, and the place all full of their papers, and these young, I don't like to say hippies, but they were young people that protested the war, and they came running along a platform. There was a raised platform, and they were pouring red paint along all these bishops' papers. And to the credit, those bishops just sat there, didn't say a thing, didn't call security, and the protesters went away. But that was a big demonstration, but they had a lot of restraint in the bishops. So he got to the thing. They gave me the microphone, and I asked them for an endorsement for our bill. And somebody way in back of the room got the microphone and said, before we endorse any bill, we ought to know what's in the bill. And unbeknownst to me, the guy I had dinner with was a secretary to the World Council of Churches. So he was well known to the crowd, so he got the microphone and said, what do we care what's in the bill? If the Native people in Alaska think it's a good bill, we should endorse it. So they did endorse it. And they said any Sunday they were talking to 40 million people in America, churchgoers, and they would ask them to write their congressman. So congressmen all over the country would get letters and support. And one other thing, we weren't very high on importance. Congress had so many things to deal with. We get down there and 10 o'clock we're supposed to testify, and they say, come back tomorrow. They had too many important things to deal with. So I was going to Seattle to talk to the Northwest Federated Tribes. They were Scoop Jackson's constituents. And I wanted them to know that he was chairman of our committee, and he had control of our bill. And I wanted them to know his people were supporting us. So I made a speech about a separate nation. And there were about 700 or 800 native Indians from down there in the meeting. So I said, we spent billions of dollars forming the new country of Israel for people who had no country. The United States could do no less for people who lost all of the American continent. And I proposed you draw a line from Anchorage to Fairbanks and west of the Canadian border. Everything west and north of that line would declare a new Indian nation, and any Indian in the continent could become a member, but be a separate nation. And it made the headlines. Senator got up on the floor here and called me a communist. And Anchorage paper wrote an editorial. Surely Mr. Notti jests, and I like to think it made a difference. I did get papers. I don't know how they found me, but I would get papers from different newspapers around the country. And so we were doing whatever we could to get higher on the list of things that had to be done in America. One thing we needed was a legal voice. We had 12 regions and 12 attorneys. And we'd go to testify, and these attorneys would testify for their clients. And it wasn't always what AFN wanted, so we got our own attorney. Again, we got John Borbridge through his Washington, D.C. law firm. He got hold of Arthur Goldberg, former Supreme Court Justice. And Arthur Goldberg brought Ramsey Clark, who was a former Attorney General, and they became our attorneys. So regardless of what everybody else said, they testified that this was AFN's position. And it made a difference because the senators didn't know these attorneys, Alaska attorneys, and they didn't pay much attention to them. And when first time I testified, Arthur Goldberg was here and Ramsey Clark was here, and Arthur Goldberg's opening statement was, "Gentlemen, this is a matter of national honor. It's our last chance for the United States to deal fairly with Native people in this country." So he served without pay. His associates got paid, but he didn't get paid. And Ramsey Clark answered a legal question and ended by saying to the chairman, "Mr. Chairman, that's my recollection of the law. If you want, I'll brief the question for you." And Scoop Jackson, who was a lawyer in his own right, said, "General, if that's your recollection of the law, I accept it." They brought us to a whole different level on our recognition and understanding. But when the Senate found out that the local attorneys had 10% fees, 10% of the land, 10% of the money would go to the lawyers from the 12 regions. The Senate busted those contracts. They wouldn't allow them. I'm almost done. the last thing was John Sackett, who was a state senator, called me one day and walking with me and he bumped my elbow and said, "Watch out, Emil. Be careful. There's a contract on you." So I ignored him. After I heard it 2 or 3 more times, I called the Attorney General here and said, "I hear there's a contract out on me. What do you know about it?" He said, "Nothing, but stay right where you're at." He had the state troopers call me back, and he said, "What you've been hearing is true. What you don't know is that we're with you 24 hours a day. We watch your kids go to school. We're outside of your house." And so it was a pretty serious threat. It bothered me for about 2 weeks, but I thought, if they're going to do it, they're going to do it. And it died off. So, but the one thing I want to say is that the land claim settlement was not a negotiated settlement. It wasn't give or take. We drafted a bill, put it out there. Congress picked it apart and put the other 8 bills. Everybody got a little bit out of it, and we got this. It's a flawed bill. So there was a former Supreme Court justice from the British Columbia was hired by the Alaskan Native Review Commission to study the effects of land claims. And he traveled all over the state, and he wrote a book called Village Journey. And here's what he said in the book. "The main concern of the Alaskan Natives, and therefore of this book, are land, self-governance, and subsistence. I recommend that the shareholders of village corporations transfer their land to tribal governments to keep the land in native ownership. The matter is one of urgency in the villages, and it should be done at once." And I agree with that. That's where I'll stop. Glad to answer any questions if you have any.
I have one. I'm Kadashan. Ich itche hit gonna huddy from the Taku Kwan. I don't need that.
Oh, we just can't catch it for the
Okay.
record.
Oh, okay. It's not working. Hello? All right. I'll start again. My name is Kadashan. I am Ichi Chihit Ganachadi from the Taku Kwan. And when I speak for my ancestors. Yanagut Yaith, Walking Raven, Alex Stevens. His sister, my mother, Sadie Nakla. Excuse me, I'm a little nervous now. Margaret Stevens. Her father, Gut Shai of the Yanyedi, Alex Stevens. His bride, Sadie Nakla. Bertha Marshall. Her father, Jack Marshall, Shuklak. His sister, Susie Shorty Gudinas, Dak Klahach. My namesake, Chief Gadashan from Wrangell. And my great uncle, Anaklahash, the last great chief of the Taku. These are my people of the river. When I go to Gold Belt and I ask, where is my land? Because they use the Taku entities and the Aquan entities to get their land holdings. And they say, we got to take a vote of the shareholders, who's made up of everybody that moved here. Where's my grandfather's land? That's my question. How do I get it back? Go to the tribal government?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think the egg will ever be unscrambled. So there's no way to get it back.
Well, then I'm just going to move and live on that land.
And yeah, it's an unfortunate situation that the way it turned out. But again, it was not a negotiated settlement. It was take it or leave it. We were broke after 5 years. People were in it, were burned out. We're going back to DC twice a month sometimes. And it's tough to fight a battle when you don't have anything to fight with. So we were lucky to get 40 million acres of land. It was almost by accident. Congress was not in the mood to give land. This House Interior Committee, the chairman was an old, crusty old guy from Colorado. And Indians didn't deserve land. He proposed a 500,000 acre settlement for all of Alaska. Interior Department proposed 1 million acres and $10 million. Nobody was in the mood to make a settlement. Ted Kennedy and Fred Harris from Oklahoma were senators. Fred Harris put in a bill for 60 million. He knew it wasn't going to pass, but he wanted to make a statement. Ted Kennedy supported 40 million acres, but it wasn't going anywhere. We had people talking to young people in the White House, and they convinced those young people, Ehrlichman, where they were talking to Ehrlichman, Haldeman, the chief guys in there, and they convinced the president, Nixon, to support 40 million acres. And his reasoning was, when he went to college in Southern California there, he played football, and his coach was an Indian. And he liked the coach. The coach liked him. And his comment was, if he wasn't an Indian, he would have been in the major leagues. So he had some sympathy for it. So he supported 40 million acres. President supported 40 million acres. When the president did that, see, the House and the Senate were both Democrats, and they weren't really moving on 40 million acres. When they put out the word that the president was supporting 40 million, all the Republicans supported the president. The Democrats weren't going to be outdone. So they got together and they passed 40 million acres. So that's how we got, a big part of how we got 40 million acres. Anybody else?
Hi, I don't have a question, but my name is Valerie Hillman. I just wanted to say that I really appreciate all the work that you guys had quite a challenge back in the day. And it just makes me proud to find that we had people fighting for us, and just want to really express my appreciation.
Thank you for your comments. If you're done, I'm done.